Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce. We're doing an episode today in a kind of a response way to Dr. James White. There's been a lot of controversy over the last, I would say, 4 to 5 days now since the debate he had with Joe Heschmeyer on the subject of the Mass, Eucharist, real presence, transubstantiation. But a lot of secondary debates came into play as a result of that debate because statements were made that were kind of out of left field that threw a lot of people off, not just Catholics and Anglicans, but other Protestants were thrown off by a statement by Dr. James White, who denied, in essence, the existence of Ignatius. So it seemed like in his first statement. I think he misspoke. And then he tried to go back and say, well, he was talking about the corpus, not the person. And so there's a lot of questions on the corpus. Then he said it was central scholarship that was denying these things. It became really problematic because I think he just stumbled over his words, never answered Joe's question. And then when he tried to go back and answer it later, he still didn't answer Joe's question. He answered a question that was from another epistle of Ignatius, not the epistle that Joe asked the question from. And it just turned into this like shovel down and keep digging that hole deeper and deeper and deeper. So I went on Cameron Bartuzzi's program and went on there with Joe Heschmeyer and Cameron Bartuzzi, and we discussed not just the statement in the debate, but also his follow-up that he did on his own program with the dividing line on Alpha and Omega. And he went in on that next day. It was Monday night, and he started going about it by not saying I misspoke or saying that he meant one thing and he accidentally said another, but his main point was this. No, he buckled down and he got stronger in his conviction by saying, I never said these things and people are distorting and distracting. It became a mess because really the only distorting and distraction that happened was him not answering Joe's question in the debate. Regardless of where you land, I think anybody on both sides of the circles, and I've seen Protestants and even Reformed Baptists critique and criticize Dr. White for using a bait and switch tactic by being the distraction. And then he came on with a friend of mine, Jeremiah Nordier, who was the debater with Dr. White the night before, but became the moderator in the debate with Joe Heschmeyer, and he did a great job. And one of the things he did is he had Dr. White back on his program on Thursday night, and there on Jeremiah's program, he gave a slight apology and said he should have just never brought it up at all, didn't think it would ever become this big of a distraction. Well, I'm at least glad he said that he shouldn't have brought it up, but for the reasons in which he apologized, I think that he should have actually gone deeper than that. But in his discussion with Jeremiah Nordier, there was a great misunderstanding pushed even further in defending this. And I felt like it was necessary for me to finally address this because he said it in a tweet or in an X post, and then he reiterated it on Jeremiah's program. And at some point, somebody, and you know, I've done programs with Dr. White. I've done it on Explore Christianity and Explain International's channel. And I've been on his channel and discussed some of the things of First Clement. He and I have done programs together over the last 5 years. And I would consider Dr. White a friend. I still have respect for him. But this situation has caused me to pause and say, wait a minute, let's have some integrity in our historical dialogue, and let's not say ridiculous things. And so I saw this trend happening. It was on X the other day and another correspondence, which I'll show you that feed in a minute. And then he got on and expounded upon it a little bit more on Jeremiah Nordier's channel. And so I'm going to pull that up on the screen. Those that are listening on the podcast, you're just going to have to listen very closely because it's very short. I mean, I'm talking a couple seconds here is all I'm going to show. But there became an important discussion on the channel about Ignatius and the rise of the bishopric. Did it come from the east? Did it come from the west? And I even time-stamped it over here on the transcript on the side for those that are seeing the video to see what I'm saying. So you can go behind this and even read the transcript if need be.
Ignatius is very important because when he writes to the church at Rome, he doesn't mention a bishop, but he does mention bishops in the East, and it does seem that the monarchical episcopate developed in the East, moved to the West.
Because one of the things that he just said is that the bishopric, the monarchical bishopric, was started in the East and it moved to the West. The reason he states this goes back to a tweet that he had not too long ago as it relates to one of the situations with the letter to the Romans that Ignatius wrote. And in the letter to the Romans, Ignatius does not address a bishop like you see him address Polycarp, for example, or he addressed others, and like in the Magnesians. He addresses individuals, I mean, presbyters, bishops. He mentions multiple deacons by name that were with him, that were sent to him, correspondence back and forth. Ignatius name dropped quite a few times in his 7 original letters. But then you get into his letter to the Romans, and so we don't see a bishopric addressed by another bishop, only in the Eastern churches that are in the other letters. So White has concluded that because of this, there is no bishopric in Rome. It's an Eastern tradition that actually made itself West. There's a lot of reasons to reject this. I want to talk about a couple of those if we can. Let's rewind earlier than Ignatius. Now, it seems like that Dr. White has taken, I'm not saying that he has, it says seems like he's taken that Ignatius is a later writing, possibly up to 180. Now, most scholars that are dealing with the Ignatian issue about when he was killed would either put it during the Hadrian persecution, which is closer to the time of Polycarp, when he died in his martyrdom. And since they were companions, there's reasonable cause to put it in that place. The historical record from Eusebius and Jerome seem to place Ignatius's martyrdom in the time of Trajan between 106, 108. So a lot of people put the date somewhere around 107. Now, I prefer to take the earlier date of Ignatius. I don't think he was as late as 180. I think at best, he is around 107. I think at worst, he would be during the Hadrian time. And I have no problem. I'm not even against that idea that he would be there because I don't think the content changes one way or another. He's a companion of those who are with the apostles. He himself has been seated in the place of Syria through the Antiochian church, through the apostolic succession of Peter. He knew John the Apostle more than likely from what references we have to him. He was established as a true person. I know that Dr. White misspoke there, but there are those that deny the existence of an Ignatian figure, that he actually did exist. But we have correspondence because Polycarp's own letter at the end of his writings to the Philippians mentions how Ignatius had written to these churches and how he was actually corresponding and utilizing these letters to the churches. So we see that at the very, very end of Polycarp's letter to the Philippians. We also see Irenaeus, who is a disciple of Polycarp, talking and quoting ideas from Ignatius. We see this also in the commentary of Song of Solomon from Origen. His commentary of Luke also uses the writings of Ignatius and referencing them. We find this in Eusebius. We find this in Jerome. He was clearly a person who wrote 7 letters. And that seems to be the consensus of even the ancient church from Eusebius and Jerome, that there were 7 authentic original letters. The question that has come into play that we've all been talking about on different programs is what recension is the proper recension that reflects the original 7 letters. Is it the longer recension? Is it the middle recension? Is it the short recension? These are the big debates. And I think they're too generic. And I'm actually going to have a guest on the program here in the next couple of weeks to talk about the different recensions. I don't even like using those terms. For one, the short recension only consists of 3 letters in the Syriac, one of which is the Romans, by the way. And it seems like that there's some validity to what we're finding in the shorter recension, but to me, they would not be the authentic. And we only have 3 letters to even reflect on as it relates to the recension of the shorter in the Syriac. There's a vast majority of manuscripts that actually cover the section called the middle recension. Everything from Latin to Greek to Coptic to Armenian. There are a vast majority of the, I would say, arguments that go toward any kind of authentic Ignatian writings, most would place it in some sort of middle recension group. The problem is within the middle recension group, when you start comparing different texts or translations of those texts, they're not exactly as close as people are trying to make them out to be. I think there's complexities even comparing with that. Dr. White also misspoke on his Monday program and misspoke in Jeremiah Nordier's about the idea of the long recension. He pretty much concluded that the long recension includes the extended letters. Like, for example, there appears to be a letter between Ignatius and Mary, where Mary wrote one to him. He wrote one in response, a correspondence with Ignatius and John the Apostle. There's these extended letters that are added later in history that we find, particularly I find it to be around the time past Arianism, because there's a lot of anti-Arianism in some of these extended letters. And Dr. White almost concluded that the longer recension included those, and they were only in Latin. Now, again, he may have misspoke, or he was only talking about one line of reasoning. But as I demonstrated, even talking with Cameron Bartuzzi and Joe Heschmeyer, this too is faulty, because Codex H, the one that I spent a lot of time researching, is the longer recensions, but it does not have all these extended writings to John and so forth. So when you're talking about and by the way, it's in Greek. So to say that they're in Latin and the longer recension includes these additional letters, longer recension does not mean there's additional letters. It means that the letters that we do have of him have extended meanings, interpolations. It seems like longer quotes of scripture rather than just singular quotes or allusions or one little framework of a statement that was taken in a quote. No, it's longer extended quotations of scripture or more of scripture. And then it seems to go out of its way to like promote a higher Christology. And I'm not saying that there wasn't a high Christology in the shorter or the middle recensions to begin with. There is a high Christology, even in the short recensions of the 3 Syriac letters we have, especially in Romans. But that's not the point either. The point is the longer recension isn't talking about the corpus. It's talking about the letters that we do have, like the 7 that we have in the longer recension. There's not additional letters. There's not. There's additional content within the 7 letters, and we do have it in Greek. It's in Codex H, which is 11th century. So it's not limited to Latin, and it's not just like this combination of, well, if you got the longer recension, then you got extra letters too. No. That is incorrect. And there was a misspeaking there as well. And I don't want to accuse him of doing it on purpose. It may have just been something he said thinking one way and it came out of his mouth another, kind of like he did in the debate. I don't know. I'm not here to attack the man. I'm here to set records straight that had been promoted and wrongly stated on multiple programs. And instead of saying, I misspoke, or I'm out of line here, or I may have overstated this fact, something like that. No, it's been excuse making after excuse making. And my advice to Dr. White would be this: please stop talking about Ignatius and sit back and do some more research beyond what you already have done. Nobody's questioning whether you've researched him before. Nobody's questioning whether you could read him in Greek, because I know you've been critiquing Cameron Bartuzzi and others like, well, until you can read Ignatius in the Greek, they can't even read it in the original languages, so their opinion doesn't matter kind of way. Okay, what about us that have? What about those of us who have read these in Greek and have done our own translations of major portions and sections and promoted these through research papers? What about us? Are we allowed to have an opinion on this? Because those that are pushing you back the most are actually people who have done what you say is the criteria for having a discussion on this. And those that have done that kind of work are asking you to please stop misrepresenting Ignatius. Please stop misrepresenting the corpus. Please stop representing the person. And let's actually sit back and evaluate the whole system. And yes, you challenge, like, what do you do when a Muslim brings this up? Look, we're not afraid. We've done that. We've had atheists bring up the corpus problem. We've had Islamic groups of people and apologists in their camps come to us and say, well, you can't use Ignatius because of this. We're not unfamiliar with the arguments, and we still use Ignatius against them and for our belief system on the Eucharist and the bishopric. Because even though, yes, there are problems, they're not to the extent that you have taken them to where we cannot rely on them as accurate historical sources, once doing the proper framework of historicity, textual criticism, and looking at them in the fuller context of all the recensions and come to a conclusion where there are places that are disputed and places that are not disputed. And the places that are disputed do not eliminate the conviction that we believe that he is teaching about the Eucharist and the bishopric, because in many of those sections, there is no dispute between any of the recensions at all. In fact, we find consistency. And that's one of the things that we pointed out in the video I did with Joe Heschmeyer and Cameron Bartuzzi that needs to be evaluated and talked about. I feel like that was skipped over unnecessarily and not even brought up in your conversation with Jeremiah the other day. And then you say things like this. So what I want to do is I want to get into the claim that was just made by Dr. White, and I want to talk about the problem that comes with that claim. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up the tweet, because this is now remember, this tweet, or X, to me it's always Twitter, but to me this actually preceded almost a month before the debate that had already come up. And I was quite surprised to see the way that it went, and I'll be happy to share the screen here as well. But I want you to keep in mind that there was a conversation that happened that I didn't realize until later seemed to already be building. Now, he keeps talking about this Easler guy who's done this research, and he sent John, the research of Jonathan. We talked about Jonathan. We talked about his research. Cameron and Joe and I all talked about it. I'd referenced his research in the past, especially his Christology research on Ignatius. I actually cited him in a couple of research works that I turned in. I was familiar with his work, and I did not get the impression from Jonathan that he was coming to these conclusions about Ignatius that Dr. White was. That threw me off. I was very, very surprised by that. And then I went back and rehearsed some of the documentation that Jonathan has put out there. And in none of that did I get the impression that he was doubting that we have any authentic writings. He does pose the same problem all of us pose, and that is there are issues within the text of Ignatius. Not enough to be skeptical or overly skeptical to use him in certain places. He builds entire research papers off of Ignatian ideas. So I found that ironic and almost rather concerning to think about as it related to his statements about Ignatius. Well, now I find out that this has already been kind of a skepticism before Joe questioned him on a statement about Ignatius. So going into this, I've got it pulled up on the screen here. And again, I'm so sorry for those that are listening. So please, I'll try to do my best to read this out loud. If you're on the podcast, if you're on YouTube, you can see it with your eyes. That's at least good for you. So I'll be very, very careful here. Now, Cameron, and I want to pronounce it, I think it's Riker. Now, I've followed him a little bit on some stuff. He has a YouTube channel, but he tweets a lot, and he follows different scholars in the field, and he does a pretty good job here. But one of the things he brought up is remaining Protestant is very difficult once you know who St. Ignatius of Antioch is. And he's using Ignatius in this regard. Now, look at the date here. This is February 7th. This is almost a month before the debate with Joe Heschmeyer. Now, Dr. White brings up this conclusion. He says, I have taught Ignatius in a graduate course in development of patristic theology. Now, again, I don't know why Dr. White always has to feel like he has to defend his credentials and because I've taught it here, it doesn't matter what you think. He does this a lot. He flexes. I call it academic flexing. No, we all do it. All of us who have done extensive research, we want people to know. We really, really want people to know what we follow and believe and study and done our research. And we always want to promote our stuff. So I'm not going to fault anybody for that. I mean, we've all done it. All of us, including me, have done that. And there is a flex of like, I do have a dog in the hunt. That's kind of our way of saying I have a dog in the hunt here. I do have a fight to pick with people on this subject. So granted that, but here this is an overexertion. It's unnecessary. It's more flexing because he's not done. Then he goes, I memorized key sections of his letters. Okay, great. I don't know why that is necessary to insert an additional, it's a flex and then a flex. It's a double flex here. Recognize the abuse of him by Roman Catholics for 1,500 years after he lived, especially in reference to the anti-Gnostic comments about the Eucharist they hijacked into an anachronistic argument of transubstantiation. I'm not saying that there aren't abuses out there. So I'm going to pause here and be very, very careful. I'm not saying that there aren't people that overexert things. There are in every group, Catholic, Protestant, Anglican. It doesn't matter where you're coming from. There are overkills in every single camp. And I want to be careful not to ignore that and say that Dr. White is just, he's off his rocker here. No. There are overextended statements. There are people that go above and beyond into the hyper world. I don't think that's the standard for most scholars who are Roman Catholic, who are evaluating Ignatius. And that's the point, because a lot of us who are Anglican, or I have Lutheran scholars, they reflect and use the same arguments of Ignatius that the Roman Catholics do. This isn't exclusive to Roman Catholic scholarship, is what I'm getting at. Anybody who has an ancient practice and belief of the Eucharist and real presence that leaves the pneumatic world into some sort of, this is the body and blood of Christ, whether consubstantiation, transubstantiation, divine mystery, whatever way you want to look at the Eucharist, Ignatius is at the forefront of a lot of the argumentation for early belief of this. So the abuses that are happening here are in a fringe minority where there's actually good scholarship across the spectrum of ancient practicing beliefs beyond Rome, Eastern, Western, Anglican. All of us hold to a strict belief on the sacrament of the Eucharist being the bodily presence of Christ in the elements. We believe that and use these statements from not just one, not just two, but multiple statements from Ignatius for our belief system in this doctrine. So to say like this is something that's been abused by Rome for up until, the 1500 years, now all of a sudden post Council of Trent, which is what he's getting at, post Council of Trent, now we have a bigger issue. I think it's a little bit unfair because they're not the only ones making this argument. He goes on to say, and smiled to recognize his letter to the Romans shows there was no Pope, not even a single bishop in Rome in his days. So I know who he was, love reading his words, and know without any doubt that he did not believe in what is believed dogmatically today as a Roman Catholic. This is from Dr. White. This is on February 7th, responding to Cameron. Well, then we have another guy here who I'm going to bring up. On X, he calls himself Philosophy and Theology. He posts a letter to the Romans that Ignatius has, and he highlights certain things, puts it in the comment section, and he basically says, Ignatius says this: you can't have a church without a bishop. Also, Ignatius of Rome says that Rome is like the best church ever. And then James White comes along and he quotes, basically almost asserting what James White would say here. Can't make inference from something other than silence. So Philosophy and Theology gets on here, and he makes a great point, and I'm going to pull this point in a little bit deeper because I think it's worth noting. But he brings up a point that we need to investigate, and that's where I want to spend the rest of this time, because I think it'll do well for us to get into the discussion of what is actually happening in Ignatius's letters. So here's kind of a summary. Dr. White states in a recent post on X that there is no bishop in Rome by the time Ignatius is writing. There's no pope. This is a later idea. So there's not even a bishopric there. He elaborates on that later in Jeremiah Nordier's video, which you can find that right at the 1 hour and 48 second mark into the 1 hour and 1 minute mark. If you're looking for that on a timestamp, I'll save you the time. Go to Jeremiah's channel, find that. You'll see it. It's a very short statement. He reiterates what he was saying on X further by saying it is an invention that happened in the East, made its way over into the West. So I'm going to use Philosophy and Theology's one argument, but I'm going to start with mine first, because I think he brings up a good point that I want to build on. So to begin with, when you're looking at the writing to the Romans, the question that comes in, and I've had multiple people already ask this question on Facebook Messenger, on X Messenger, Hey, Dr. Boyce, what do you say to what Dr. White said about the rise of the bishopric in the East? There is no bishop represented in the West, right? My answer is no. You're right, and Dr. White is right. There is no direct bishop mentioned in his letter to the Romans, like you see in some of his other letters. But don't stop there. Ignatius doesn't mention any type of leader in the Church of Rome in that same letter. He doesn't mention any presbyters. He doesn't mention any deacons. So are we to conclude, folks, that right from that, I guess Rome just didn't have any deacons or presbyters because he didn't mention any of them? See, this is the fallacy of going about it from that approach. Oh, well, there's no bishop mentioned in Rome, only in the East. So there was no bishop in Rome. There was only a bishop in the East. And it later influenced this belief system in the bishopric. Now, I'm going to go through multiple reasons why that's wrong. One, logically, that doesn't make sense just from the letter, because then you got to conclude they didn't have a plurality of elders leading the church either, because he addressed not a single one, not a single deacon. And as I mentioned earlier, Ignatius loved name dropping. No name drops. He does mention those in Syria at the end of the letter, but he does not mention any bishopric, presbyter, or deacon as it relates. But he does address the church as a whole. So let's talk about that. I think this is the most important discussion that needs to be had. Does Ignatius mention a bishopric without mentioning a bishopric? Yep, he sure does. So let's kind of talk about that. In his introduction to the church, here we have different levels of his writings. You've got the Ephesians, Magnesians, Philadelphians, Trallians, Polycarp, Smyrnans, all the letters. Here we're in Romans, and it's the introduction to the Romans, I may add. But there's important words that we're gonna show here, and I'm going to start with English, and I'm going to move over to the Greek and show you where they are. This line right here. So he's addressing the church, who he says is beloved of God, beloved of the Lord Jesus. They, found mercy and in the majesty of the Father Most High. You have all this. Then he goes down to this line right here, which also presided in the place of the country of the Romans. Now, I don't necessarily like the word country here. It's not a bad translation, but I don't think it conveys the idea. It's more of land. It's more of a region, the regions or the landmarks, if you would, of this location. Now, one of the points I want to make here is this word here. Prokathete en topo choriou Romiaon. So you have the line I just read in English. And here's the word, prokothete. Now, if you look at the word prokothete, it's an interesting word because we don't really see this form of it in the New Testament or in the LXX, in the Old Testament Septuagint. What we do see is this word used in the 4th Maccabees, chapter 5, verse 1, in relation to Antiochus. And the way that it reads in Antiochus is fascinating to me, because one of the things it talks about is how he is ruling from the seat. And it uses this word, talking about the idea of judgment, because the word here carries a connotation of rulership or authority from a chair, from a seat, the seat of judgment, the seat of authority. We find that in 4th Maccabees in relation to Antiochus. Here, we find this word in Ignatius's writings, which is very, very hard to find elsewhere. And a lot of times it's translated presided, which is a good word. It's a good word to translate it as. Presided over the country of the Romans, or in the region of Romans. So you have this jurisdiction, this location, and there is a rulership of it. Now, he repeats this word in a different form a little bit further down. And in English, I want to show you how it's translated here, because it goes through this idea. They're worthy of honor and blessing and praise and success, sanctification. And here's the word, and presiding over love. Now, I think in love is a better translation here. And I'm going to show you this word again because we find the phrase right here in Greek, okay? Prakathemene, tes, agapes. Presiding, it could be over love, in love. So this idea is they are ruling from a seat, not just a region, but out of love. The attitude of the seat of Rome is in love. Now, why is this word important? Why am I bringing this up? Because I want to go into his letter to the Magnesians. And in his letter to the Magnesians, I'm going to pull up a section here because we find him only use this word twice in his opening to the Romans and once in his writing to the Magnesians. In chapter 6, verse 1, I'm going to read it for you in English, just like I did first. Now he says, may the bishop preside in God's place, and may the presbyters take place in the council of the apostles, and may the deacons, who are the most delightful to me, because they have been entrusted with the ministry of Jesus Christ, who before eternity was with the Father and appeared at the end of time. Now, here we are in our writing again. We're looking at another word. We see the word used once more. This is where I want to get into. Now, I want to bring in the wording here that we can find in different forms, different verbs, whether it's in the middle passive or in the present active, etc. Here's the word that we've been talking about this whole time. Now, again, he's going to use it one more time. Prokothemenu to episcopal. Okay, so here it is. Here it is. Here's our word. It's presiding, that rulership. Who does he attach the presiding and rulership over? Who does that word get attached to in the writings of Ignatius? Well, here in the Magnesians, he attaches it to the episcopal or the episcopate or that of the bishop. So the bishop is doing the presiding from a seat. He is in a chair of authority, a seat of authority. But notice the threefold ministry. You have the bishop who presides, you have the presbyters who take place in the council of the apostles, and the deacons, there it is, who he says are the most delightful, studying the servitude and ministry of Jesus. Now, why did I show you all this? Because when we're talking about this subject, we have to acknowledge something here. That the presbyteros, the presbyters, are not doing the overseeing. They're not doing the presiding. That's to the bishopric. And what philosophy and theology was trying to point out in the tweet or in the X post is that when you go back, and he does this on 3 occasions in the letters, he does it to the Smyrnans, he does it in the epistles that were, he showed a clip of it to Dr. White on Twitter. And when he was going through all this, one of the things that he kept pointing out is that the statement is constantly made by Ignatius. If there's no bishop, you have no church. So he would be contradicting himself by writing to a church and calling it a church if there's no bishopric. But as we just demonstrated, there was a bishopric. There was a bishopric because only the bishops do the presiding, the term of sitting from the seat. Now, why doesn't he address a single individual? There's 2 possible causes here, and I want to point both these causes out. Number 1, here's the grand thing. The entirety of the Church of Rome was seen as the see, or really the authority from St. Peter and Paul. St. Peter and Paul are ruling from this point. The East and the West come together through Paul and Peter, especially Antioch, with which Ignatius is from. And it's intriguing to me that he looks at the whole church, the whole entire See of Rome, as the authority of the jurisdiction, and that they are ruling, presiding in the act of love. It's also intriguing that he builds on this, that in the writing to the Romans, he does not give commandments in the same manner he does to these other churches. He entreats the Church of Rome. He makes request of the Church of Rome. He speaks in adoration of the Church of Rome. That's exactly what Philosophy and Theology was saying in that post. His attitude towards Rome is different because he sees it as an authoritative see. Now, what becomes later known as the chair of Peter, the seat of Peter, is probably deriving from these ideas because the presiding has an idea of sitting in a chair of authority, sitting in a seat of authority, as it's used in 4th Maccabees 5:1, as we see it used in relation to the bishopric in Magnesian 6:1, as we see it used twice here in Romans. So Dr. White's assertion is, oh, this was created from the West, is far-fetched, or from the East into the West is far-fetched. It's far-fetched. He's saying to have a church, you have to have a bishop. And if there's no bishop, there's no church. So he's not going to contradict himself in that. 2, we see a presiding terminology twice, not once, twice in his very opening. But he's recognizing it as the see of Rome is bigger than a single man, rather than an entire institution of the apostles that is presiding in love and out of love to all others. And he's appealing to that love, appealing to that grace that they found in the eyes of the Lord. And he's not demanding, as we see, in not in a bad way, but in a good way from the other churches, but imploring and inquiring of them and asking and pleading with them on his behalf. It's different. It's different. His attitude is different toward the Church of Rome than we see to, say, those in Magnesian or the Trailians or the Smyrnans. It is different. So I don't accept this. Now, another reason I don't accept this is we know a bishopric already exists, and I mentioned this earlier about Clement of Rome. Now, there's a lot of dispute whether or not Clement of Rome can be seen as the second bishop of Rome or the fourth. Now, I hold to the fact that he is the fourth. So I place the letter of First Clement toward the 90s, late 90s. Now, I have good friends who want to go earlier and you know, for good cause. I mean, they don't have ridiculous reasoning. The section in 41 where he talks about the objects and in looking at the sacrificial system in Jerusalem and the high priest, and that there's this patterning that's going on. They talk about how the high priest is readily daily making these sacrifices for sin and so forth. And then Clement goes into that comparison. And by the way, 42 is brought up in our discussion with Joe Heschmeyer and Cameron Bartuzzi. These discussions are good to have, and it seems to indicate, well, the temple's still doing this. I don't necessarily accept that. I think that it's using an analogy of what was done. But I have sympathy for those that try to place this earlier. I take him to be the fourth bishop of Rome. I think that there were others. I think St. Linus was second. And there's a lot of dispute about the second, third, and fourth. There's no dispute about the names, but the positions and who succeeded who. I think the proper one is to put him fourth, which put him at the very, very end of Domitian. And then obviously we come into the time of Trajan. So I think he's in that time. I think he's at the end of the 90s, around the time of the book of Revelation and the Apocalypse of John. I think that's where he's writing personally. And I have a lot of reasons for that. I've done an entire episode of First Clement. I don't want to get onto that in this because that's a distraction from the main point. The main point is, did a bishopric exist in Rome? Because Dr. White's saying it actually came over from the tradition of the East. And I'm going to show you that whether you believe Clement is 60s or 90s, he's still earlier than Ignatius. And he talks about the institution of this group. Now, in 42, a lot of people pause, and I'm going to actually pull this up because it's on newadvent.org. I'll share my screen. It's on newadvent.org. We find in chapter 42, which is really better to say a section, that the apostles have preached the gospel from us to the Lord. And he goes through this whole process, and this is a section that we talked about on Cameron's channel. And he gets into the idea of bishops and deacons. And this is where people will instantly stop and say, wait a minute, he's quoting Isaiah here. And by the way, he's quoting Isaiah very interesting because we don't have this reading in the Septuagint or in the Hebrew that he's quoting as he relates it to the deacons and the faith and the bishops. But we do find this intriguing section where people go, see, the standard in Rome was a bishopric and diaconate only. So the bishop is a presbyter. They're the same office. And people never finish the comparison. The comparison he made in the previous section, which is what Joe and myself were talking about in the video. If you go back to chapter 40 and chapter 41 here, you'll find that he's making a comparison of the high priest and the Levites in the temple. So if you have a high priest, you have a leader of the priest, you also have the performance of the other priests, and you have the Levites, high priest, the other priest, the Levites. And he's giving us a comparison that the high priest is overseeing the process of the sacrament, the mass, the atoning, if you would, in the Old Testament. He has other priests working with him and under his authority. And then you have Levites working with them, doing the servitude and daily tasks needed in the temple. And so we see this threefold ministry paralleled by Clement as it relates to the high priest and the bishopric, the presiding bishop. Then you see the presbyteros, the presbyters, the elders serving in place as the priests under the high priest. And then you see the deacons in relation to the Levites. You see the threefold ministry. And what people do is they only come to chapter 42. They don't read the previous comparison. And then they don't finish the section here about how and why the apostles appointed the bishopric to begin with. As if we needed to add Acts 1 into this, Clement gives us more reason. He says, our apostles also knew through our Lord Jesus Christ there would be strife on account of the office of the episcopate. For this reason, therefore, inasmuch as they had obtained a perfect foreknowledge, that they appointed those ministers already mentioned, and afterwards gave instruction that these should fall asleep, being the apostles, other approved men should succeed them in their ministry. We are of opinion, therefore, that these appointed by them, or afterward by other eminent men with the consent of the whole church, so that this isn't like a Eastern-Western thing. This is not an Eastern-Western. This is the universal Catholic Church. And who blamelessly serve the flock of Christ and the humble, peaceable. Now, catch this. Notice the attitude of the bishops. It is not out of like contention or power or some hungry struggle here. That's not the point. He said, cannot be justified and dismissed in the ministry. For our sin will not be small if we eject from the episcopate those who have been blamelessly and wholly fulfilled in the duties. Blessed are those presbyters who have finished their course before now and have obtained a fruitful and perfect departure from the world. For they have no fear, lest anyone deprive of the place now appointed to them. But we see that you have removed some men of excellent behavior from the ministry, and they fulfill blamelessly with honor. Now, again, here's the point. You see the presbyter and the bishop as distinct, but yet similar. And I said this on the program with Cameron. All presbyters are not bishops, but all bishops are presbyters. Just like all presbyters are deacons, but not all deacons are presbyters. Because there was this training process where you can see it, and it's even practiced today, to be a presbyter, you have to become a deacon first. To be a bishop, you would have had to have been a deacon and a presbyter. So there are times where, not on a few occasions in the early church, we find that not all bishops that we find in our correspondence carry this idea of like, oh, we're strong and powerful. We're gonna take over the churches. No. Clement said that this was universally received. So there was a bishopric, including in Rome, where he's writing from, as a bishop of Rome. But then we find that there's times where they're used interchangeably and separate. And 44 is where we see them used separate, but the same, because all bishops are presbyters, but not all presbyters are bishops. Because you have to be one to be the other. But just because you're a bishop doesn't mean you're exempt from stopping the process of being a presbyter or a deacon. You will always be those things, but not, you can't look at a deacon and say, well, they're a bishop. They're the same, interchangeable. Or you can say, oh, look, there's a deacon. He's the same as a presbyter. All presbyters are deacons, but not all deacons are presbyters. You've got to look at the system and how they actually progressed in this. They prove themselves by this ministry. And we see this already showing itself in the Ignatian writings. So there is a bishopric, and he tells us why. Why did the apostles set up a bishopric? They set up a bishopric so it stops schism in the church, and so that appointed men would be in a position of authority to continue the ministry of the apostles, to protect the deposit of faith, to protect it from brokenness and schism. What ends up happening here is that the church in Corinth, as I mentioned on Cameron's program, starts kicking these people out like Congregationalists. And he's saying, what are you doing? These are approved men. You have no cause to do this. So there is a bishopric. And then a bishop is writing authoritatively to a church in Philippi for throwing bishops out as if they're congregational-led churches or something. And he distinguishes, yet shows the similarities of them in the terminology from chapters 40 down to 44 in his letter. So actually, there is a bishopric in Rome, and it existed before Ignatius. So to say that Ignatius would have never addressed one is ridiculous. I just showed the evidence of it. He said there's no church if there's no bishop. Obviously, there has to be a bishop by Ignatius's own standard. The terminology is authority to a bishopric, and it seems like his view of Rome is that they had an entire authoritative position as a church amongst the universal churches, that they are the see of Peter and Paul and have a high position of honor amongst all the churches. And that's why he treats them different. And we see that it was established by the apostles to have these sees earlier in the writings of Clement, who is a bishop in Rome before Ignatius's martyrdom. So I cannot accept Dr. White's statements. I do not agree with them. All right, folks, that is the discussion. Was the bishopric a creation of the Eastern churches? No, this was not. This was a universal consensus. All right, thanks for tuning into this episode of Facts. Grace and peace to you. God bless.